Hello, my name is Nathan Whitaker. I am a soldier serving in the United States Army, currently stationed at a small base on the outskirts of Virginia. If you ask me about my family, I'd say it's a long story, filled with conflicts and silences that I'm not sure I want to revisit. But if you were here, sitting with me in this modest rented room with an old wooden table and the sound of the wind whistling through the window frame, I'd tell you. Not to boast, nor to complain. Simply so you'd understand why I stand here in a world I've never truly belonged to. I was born in Greenwich, Connecticut, a town people often call the paradise of the elite. Tree-lined streets, mansion-like homes, and Rolls-Royces gliding past each other as if it's the most ordinary thing. My family, the Whitakers, was part of that picture. My father, Robert Whitaker, owned a real estate portfolio inherited from my grandfather, James Whitaker, the founder of Whitaker Holdings, a prominent investment and real estate conglomerate in the Northeast United States. My grandfather was a legend, at least in my eyes. He was born into poverty, raised in a rickety wooden house on the outskirts of Boston, where winters were so cold the water in the pipes froze. From nothing, he built an empire, not through luck but through discipline, intelligence, and an iron will. He once told me when I was just a little boy sitting on his knee in a library filled with the smell of old books, "Nathan, money is just a tool. The real value lies in how you use it." I'm not sure I fully understood him then, but those words etched themselves into my mind like a seed waiting to sprout. But that's the story of my grandfather. My father, Robert, and his younger brother, Uncle Harold, were a different tale. They weren't like Grandpa. My father lived and spent money as if it grew on trees. Lavish parties, private jet vacations, bespoke suits tailored in London, all to maintain appearances among the elite. Uncle Harold was no different. I remember when I was 10, he pulled up to our house in a brand new Ferrari, parked it in the driveway, and called out to me, "Hey Nathan, look at this. This is the life." I just stood there, clutching a book on astronomy, watching the car gleam in the sunlight and wondering if that was really what Grandpa had wanted. My father and uncle didn't run Whitaker Holdings with any seriousness. They sold off shares, siphoned money from the company for personal expenses, and slowly, the empire Grandpa built began to crumble. But they didn't care. To them, prestige was everything, and prestige could be bought with parties and magazine photos. My family consists of 3 siblings. I'm the youngest. My older brother, Mike, 4 years my senior, lives in Soho, Manhattan. He's the type you'd see in upscale bars, driving a red Porsche, always with a beautiful woman by his side. Mike likes to call me the poor soldier whenever we meet, usually at Christmas or Dad's birthday. He laughs loudly, slaps my shoulder, and says, "Nathan, you should ditch that lowly soldier gig. Make real money like me." I never respond. Not because I have nothing to say, but because I know that behind that smile, Mike lives off family handouts, the money Dad throws at him to sustain his lavish lifestyle. Then there's my older sister, Lily, 2 years older than me, living in Los Angeles. She's an influencer, posting about her glamorous life on Instagram. Maldives vacations, Hermes bags, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. But I know the truth. Lily lives on credit card debt. She calls Dad every month begging for more money, and he always indulges her. Once she called me, her voice dripping with condescension. "Nathan, you should learn to enjoy life a little. Living so miserably, Grandpa would be so disappointed." I just smiled and said, "Lily, I live my way. You keep living yours." She laughed, thinking I was joking, but I didn't bother explaining. Arguing with Lily is like trying to convince a star it doesn't shine. As for me, I'm the youngest in the family, the black sheep everyone mocks. From a young age, I was different. While Mike and Lily loved parties and fancy dinners with expensive wine, I'd be in my room reading about the universe or studying how the stock market works. I didn't care about designer clothes or loud parties. I liked sitting on the rooftop of my grandmother's house in Stamford, staring at the night sky and imagining myself among the stars. The rest of the family called me the weirdo, the bookworm. My father once sighed, looked at me, and said, "Nathan, you need to be more realistic. But their reality wasn't mine. Grandpa was the only one who understood me. He'd pull me into the library, show me books on philosophy and economics, and tell me about his youth, when he worked 16 hours a day to support his family. He never bragged, but every story was a lesson. When he passed away, I was only 10. It was the first time I felt like the world had collapsed. He was the only one in the family who made me feel like I belonged. After his funeral, I found a letter he'd written to me tucked inside an old book. "Nathan, you have a fire in your heart. Don't let anyone extinguish it. Live true to yourself, and one day you'll make the world see you differently." I keep that letter with me like a reminder, a torch lighting up my darkest days. My family isn't poor. On the contrary, we're wealthy, at least in name. Whitaker Holdings once owned dozens of buildings in Manhattan, Connecticut, and Boston. But that wealth is slipping away bit by bit. Dad and Uncle Harold sell off assets to sustain their extravagant lifestyles. They don't invest, don't build, just spend. Mike and Lily are the same, living in the fading glow of the past, while I, the overlooked youngest child, chose a different path. I didn't want to be like them. I wanted to be like Grandpa, a man who lived by principles, perseverance, and a fierce belief that true value lies not in what others see, but in what you build. I grew up in solitude. At school, I didn't have many friends. I wasn't good at socializing, didn't know how to fit in with kids who only cared about showing off new sneakers or European vacations. I preferred sitting alone in the library, reading about people like Benjamin Graham or Warren Buffett, who turned intelligence and discipline into wealth. I loved looking at the night sky and wondering if there was a place out there where I truly belonged. But I never let that loneliness defeat me. I learned to turn it into strength. Every time Mike mocked me, every time Lily sneered at me, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because I knew one day I'd prove them wrong. When I was 16, my parents divorced. It was a messy, dramatic affair splashed across tabloids with accusations flying back and forth. My father had a new lover, a woman 20 years his junior. My mother, too, started dating a wealthy New York lawyer. I don't want to talk much about my mother. She gave birth to me, but she also caused me the most pain. The way she treated me, the way she looked at me, made me feel like I wasn't her child at all. So after the divorce, I didn't want to live with either of them. I didn't want to stay in Greenwich where everything felt fake, where people saw me as a failure just because I didn't chase the spotlight. I decided to move in with my grandmother, Evelyn Whitaker, in Stamford. She was a strict but loving woman living true to Grandpa's spirit. She never showed off, never boasted. She taught me how to neatly fold my blankets every morning, how to save every penny, and how to cherish the small things in life. A home-cooked meal, a quiet evening under a starry sky. The time I spent with her shaped who I am. She told me stories about Grandpa, about the days he worked in a steel mill to pay for college. She taught me that discipline is the foundation of all success, that gratitude is the only way to live a meaningful life. "Nathan," she once said, "life isn't a race to be the richest. It's a race to be the best version of yourself." I carried those words with me, like a compass as I embarked on the next chapter of my life. At 18, I stood at the gates of the United States Military Academy at West Point, a small suitcase in hand, my heart pounding as if it might burst through my chest. I didn't know what I expected. Perhaps an escape, a way to leave behind Greenwich, the mocking gazes of my family, and prove that I could stand on my own. West Point was not a place for the weak. Those early days nearly broke me. Mornings began at 5 with the shouts of commanding officers and physical training that left my body aching. I remember nights lying on a bunk bed in the dormitory, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. But every time I wanted to give up, I thought of my grandfather, of his calloused hands building Whitaker Holdings from nothing. If he could do it, I had to as well. The military taught me things Greenwich never could. Discipline, not the kind you read about in books, but the kind carved into every step, every salute, every moment you put the team above yourself. I learned to control my emotions, to stand firm under pressure, and to find light in the darkest days. But the most important lesson the military taught me was the value of perseverance. There were training sessions that lasted hours in the rain, my boots soaked and my hands trembling from the cold. There were nights I stayed up studying tactics while my classmates slept soundly, but I never complained. I knew every drop of sweat, every late night was a step toward becoming the person I wanted to be. After graduating from West Point, I was assigned to the U.S. Army, stationed at a base in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Military life wasn't glamorous. I lived in a small room with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a closet just big enough for my uniforms and a few civilian clothes. My salary wasn't high, but I didn't need much. I had learned from my grandmother to live simply. A modest meal, an old pickup truck, and a book were enough to keep me content. But deep down, I carried a greater ambition. I wanted to build something, not to show off, but to prove I could carry on my grandfather's legacy in my own way. When I was 24, an event changed everything. My grandmother passed away. I received the news during a training session at the base. I requested leave and drove to Stamford that night, my heart heavy. She was the last person in my family who truly understood me, the only one who never looked at me with disappointment. Her funeral was quiet, without the noisy articles or grandiose speeches. My father attended but left after a few hours. Mike and Lily sent flowers but didn't show up. I stood alone by her casket, looking at her kind face one last time, and vowed to live in a way that would make her proud. A few weeks later, her lawyer called me to his office in Stamford. He handed me a thick envelope containing a handwritten letter from her and documents for a trust fund. She had left me $1 million, a sum separate from my father's control. Her letter was brief, but every word cut deep. Nathan, this is not a gift to spend. It is a challenge to prove who you are. Let this money grow through your wisdom and principles. But never forget why you were given it. I read that letter over and over, tears silently falling onto the page. It wasn't just money. It was her faith in me, the legacy of her and my grandfather placed in my hands. I didn't rush. I didn't run out and buy a luxury car or a Manhattan apartment like Mike or Lily might have. Instead, I spent nights studying. I read every finance book I could find, from The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham to Security Analysis by David Dodd. I studied ETFs, stocks, and bonds. I learned to analyze financial statements, evaluate companies, and predict market trends. I wasn't a genius. There were nights I stayed up until 3 in the morning, eyes burning from staring at a computer screen, trying to understand why a stock crashed or a fund surged unexpectedly. But I didn't give up. I knew every minute I spent learning was a step away from my family's shadow. I started investing. At first, I played it safe. ETFs tracking the S&P 500, stocks in defense companies like Lockheed Martin, industries I understood from my work. I took some risks too, putting money into clean tech startups, companies trying to change the world with renewable energy. I didn't invest to get rich quick. I invested to build, to create something sustainable. Each month, I set aside part of my soldier's salary to add to my portfolio. I didn't splurge. My old pickup truck still ran fine, my rented apartment was enough, and I didn't need lavish parties to feel valuable. By the time I was 32, my wealth had crossed the $50 million mark. The number sounded unreal even to me. I never told anyone, not my father, not Mike or Lily. I still went to work every day, wore my uniform, carried out my duties, and lived like an ordinary soldier. I didn't want anyone to know, not because I feared their envy, but because I didn't need their validation. I had done this not to prove anything to them, but to prove it to myself, to my grandfather, and to my grandmother. Yet deep down, I knew that one day the truth would come out. Not because I wanted to boast, but because life has a way of revealing everything. While I quietly built my future, my family slid further into ruin. My father and Uncle Harold, no longer able to maintain their lavish Greenwich mansions, sold them to pay debts and moved into rented apartments in an upscale Tribeca complex in Manhattan. Mike and Lily, who once lived in luxurious private homes, faced similar fates. Mike burned through his allowance on cars and parties, eventually selling his Soho apartment to cover debts. Lily, buried under credit card debt from maintaining her glamorous social media image, had no choice but to move to Tribeca, living in the same complex as Dad and Uncle Harold. They rented expensive apartments, trying to keep up their elite facade, but I knew the truth. They were living on their last dollars, clinging to illusions of wealth long gone. Once during a leave, I visited my father in Tribeca. His apartment was on a high floor with glass windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. He sat in a leather chair, sipping whiskey, and spoke to me with disappointment. "Nathan, you should find a better job. What's a soldier good for? Look at Mike and Lily, they know how to live." I looked at him, said nothing, and nodded. I didn't want to argue. But as I left the apartment, I heard Lily's loud laughter from the unit next door, live streaming on Instagram, showing off a new bag I knew she'd bought with borrowed money. Mike drove his now old Porsche past the building, stopping to take photos as if he were still a flashy playboy. I quietly walked out, got into my pickup truck, and drove away. They had no idea I'd quietly amassed a fortune they couldn't imagine. One night, I sat in my small apartment looking at the night sky through the window. I held my grandmother's letter, rereading the yellowed words. "Let this money grow through your wisdom and principles." I smiled. I had done it, not just because of the money in my account, but because I had lived true to what she taught me. But I knew my journey wasn't over. My family still lived in their illusions, still thought of me as the poor soldier, the outcast. I didn't blame them, but I also wasn't going to let them live in that deception forever. I never thought I'd witness the day when the Whitaker family, once so proud of their name, would fall so low. But at 35, sitting in my modest Virginia apartment, gazing out the window at the night sky, I knew their decline wasn't surprising. It had started long ago when my father and Uncle Harold sold off pieces of my grandfather's legacy to fuel their lavish lifestyles. When Mike and Lily spent as if money would never run out. They lived in a world of illusions, where the Whitaker name's glamour blinded them to the reality that they were losing everything. I heard about my family through old acquaintances, snippets of news in the papers, and the rare messages they sent me. My father and Uncle Harold had sold nearly all the assets my grandfather left behind. The Greenwich mansions where I grew up now belonged to other families. The Manhattan office buildings where my grandfather once worked were mortgaged or sold off cheaply to pay debts. Whitaker Holdings, the conglomerate my grandfather built from nothing, was now a shadow of itself, with most shares in the hands of outside investors. My father was no longer the company's chairman. He'd stepped down long ago, leaving behind a chaotic management team and a fading reputation. They had nowhere left to go except the upscale apartment complex in Tribeca, Manhattan. I learned about it from an old friend who once worked for Whitaker Holdings. "Nathan," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with disbelief, "did you know your whole family, your dad, Uncle Harold, Mike, and Lily, are renting apartments in Tribeca? They're living like they're still billionaires, but everyone knows they've sold off their homes." I nodded silently, though he couldn't see me. I wasn't surprised. It was the inevitable consequence of years spent living without a thought for tomorrow. My father rented a penthouse with windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. Uncle Harold lived a floor below in a smaller but still exorbitant apartment. Mike and Lily, after selling their own places in Soho and Los Angeles, moved into the same building, surviving on loans and the last scraps of Dad's handouts. While my family sank in their delusions, I kept building my path, quietly but resolutely. My wealth, now well past the $50 million mark, was the result of 10 years of discipline and learning. I never stopped investing. I poured money into stable ETFs, defense stocks, and clean tech startups I believed could change the world. Once I invested in a company developing renewable energy batteries, drawn by an article about its founder, a young engineer who, like my grandfather, grew up in poverty. That company later tripled in value, and I smiled, not for the money, but because I knew I was doing things right. I also began exploring real estate, the field my grandfather once dominated. I didn't want to just buy buildings for profit. I wanted to reclaim what my family had lost, piece by piece. One day, I got a call from a broker in New York. "Nathan, there's a plot of land on the outskirts of Virginia near your base. It's going cheap because the developer's in trouble. Want to take a look?" I studied it carefully, spending nights analyzing data, and finally decided to buy. It was my first real estate deal, and when the project was completed, a small residential community with affordable homes, I felt a pride no amount of money could buy. I had built something, just as my grandfather once did. But I didn't stop there. I started seeking bigger opportunities, especially in Manhattan. I knew that one day I'd face my family, not with words, but with actions. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted them to understand that true value doesn't lie in rented apartments, Instagram photos, or boasts. Value lies in what you build, what you hold fast to, even when the world turns its back on you. I just wanted them to understand that true value doesn't lie in rented apartments, Instagram photos, or boasts. Value lies in what you build, what you hold fast to, even when the world turns its back on you. In the winter of my 36th year, I decided to invest more heavily in real estate. Not to compete with anyone, but to reclaim what my family had lost in my own way. For months, I had quietly studied the Manhattan market, scouring for opportunities others overlooked. One day, my old financial advisor from New York called, his voice brimming with excitement. "Nathan, there's a big opportunity. The upscale apartment complex in Tribeca, where your father and uncle are renting, is up for sale. The developer's in financial trouble. They need to sell fast." I sat in silence, absorbing every detail. That building wasn't just a property. It was where my entire family, my father, Uncle Harold, Mike, and Lily, lived, flaunting their elite lifestyles while drowning in debt. I knew this wasn't just a deal. It was a chance to remind them of true value. I worked day and night meeting with investors, lawyers, and banks. I didn't want just a piece. I wanted to own the entire complex. After 3 months of intense negotiations, I closed the deal. I bought the building at a higher price than expected, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my grandfather's legacy, brick by brick. I kept it a secret, not telling anyone in the family. I wanted them to feel it, to face the truth without me saying a word. That Christmas season arrived, and as usual, my father hosted a grand party at his Tribeca apartment. I received an invitation via a curt text from Lily. "Nathan, come to Christmas. Dad wants the family together. Don't let us down." I read the message and gave a faint smile. Together? For them, together was just an excuse to show off, to take photos for social media, to keep living the illusion that they were still the powerful Whitakers of old. I agreed to attend, not because I wanted to fit in, but because I knew this would be the night everything changed. I drove my old pickup truck to Tribeca, parking a few blocks away. I wore a simple sweater, jeans, and my worn-out army boots. As I entered the building's lobby, the crystal chandelier gleamed, illuminating marble walls. The receptionist nodded politely, unaware that I was the new owner. I took the elevator to the 30th floor, where my father's apartment was. Christmas music spilled from inside, mingling with loud laughter and chatter. I took a deep breath and knocked. Lily opened the door, sparkling in a sequined dress, her hair perfectly waved. She looked me up and down, raising an eyebrow. "My God, Nathan, still dressing like a poor soldier? Coming here like that, aren't you embarrassed?" I didn't respond, just smiled and stepped inside. The apartment was lavishly decorated, a Christmas tree towering to the ceiling, draped in lights and golden ornaments, a table laden with dishes from a 5-star restaurant, and champagne flowing like a stream. Mike stood in a corner holding a drink, regaling Uncle Harold with some story, both laughing loudly. My father sat in an armchair, dressed in a suit, looking like a king in his own realm. Mike and Lily's kids ran around the living room, everything seeming perfectly normal. But I knew it was a facade. This apartment, like those of Mike, Lily, and Uncle Harold in the building, was rented. They had sold off their assets and were living on their last dollars, on lies they told themselves. "Nathan," my father called, his voice slightly slurred. "Come here, son. Sit down, have a drink." I nodded, took a glass of water, and sat at the edge of the table. Mike turned to me, slapping my shoulder harder than necessary. "Hey, soldier boy, still driving that rusty truck? When are you gonna live like a real Whitaker?" The room erupted in laughter, as if Mike's jab was a stroke of genius. Lily chimed in. "Nathan, why don't you move to Tribeca?" "Oh wait, the rent here's not cheap. With your soldier's pay, you'd never make it. Don't dream too big." She giggled, glancing around for approval. I said nothing, sipping my water, my eyes scanning each person in the room. They didn't know. They had no idea what was coming. The party went on, filled with the usual boasts. Uncle Harold bragged about a real estate deal he almost won big, though I knew he'd sold his last Whitaker Holdings shares to pay debts. Mike talked about a new car he planned to buy, though a mutual friend told me his old Porsche had been repossessed. Lily busied herself taking photos, editing them at the table for Instagram, captioning them. Whitaker Christmas, luxury and class. I sat quietly, feeling like I was watching a play where everyone performed, unaware the script was about to change. As the party wound down, with everyone tipsy, I stood up, pulled out my phone, and called Tom, the building manager I'd been working with since buying the complex. "Tom," I said calmly, "I want you to start drafting new notices. Starting next month, double the rent for the apartments of Robert Whitaker, Harold Whitaker, Mike Whitaker, and Lily Whitaker. No negotiations." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Tom replied, "Understood, Mr. Whitaker. I'll prepare them immediately." I hung up, and at that moment, Lily, standing closest to me, overheard. She burst out laughing as if I'd told a joke. "Oh my God, Nathan, are you playing landlord now? Who do you think you are, raising the rent? Do you even know who owns this building?" Mike jumped in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, Nathan, you've lost it. What, you got a promotion in the army and turned billionaire overnight?" The room roared with laughter again, even my father, who looked at me with a mix of pity and disappointment. I said nothing, just nodded, bid them goodbye, and left the apartment. I didn't need to explain. The truth would speak for itself. The next morning, with Christmas cheer still in the air, a storm was brewing at the Tribeca complex. I got a text from Tom confirming the notices had been sent to each apartment. I pictured the scene. Building staff knocking on doors, delivering crisp white envelopes with official seals, announcing that rent would double at the next lease renewal. No exceptions, no negotiations. I knew how my father, Uncle Harold, Mike, and Lily would react. They'd yell, call the manager, demand to speak to the owner to protest. But they didn't know the owner was sitting in a small Virginia apartment, sipping tea and rereading his grandmother's letter. As expected, my phone started ringing at noon. First was Lily. "Nathan, what is this? Are you joking? Double the rent? You're behind this, aren't you? What right do you have?" Her voice trembled, her usual confidence gone. I replied briefly, "Lily, I'm not joking. If you want to stay, pay the rent. If not, you know what to do." She screamed, calling me selfish before hanging up. Next was Mike, his voice seething. "Who do you think you are, Nathan? You think you can pull this on your own family? I'll sue you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Finally, my father called. His voice was weary, almost pleading. "Nathan, what are you doing? Why are you doing this to your family? We're blood. You can't treat us like this." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Dad, I'm not taking back honor. I'm taking back value. If you and the others want to stay, pay the rent like anyone else. If not, you know what to do." I hung up before he could say more. I didn't want to argue or explain. I had spent my life living by my principles, and now I wanted them to face the consequences of their choices. Over the next few days, the family held an emergency meeting at my father's apartment. They texted, called, demanded I come to explain. I refused. Instead, I sent a single message to the family group chat. I'm not taking back honor. I'm taking back value. You can stay if you pay the rent. If not, leave. I turned off my phone, letting them figure it out. I knew they couldn't afford the new rent. They had sold their assets, squandered their money on frivolous things. They had no choice but to leave. I didn't feel joy in doing this. I didn't do it for revenge, though a small part of me wanted them to feel the cost of their arrogance. I did it because I wanted them to understand. Value doesn't lie in upscale apartments, luxury cars, or Instagram photos. Value lies in what you build, what you hold fast to, what you leave behind for the world. I bought the complex not to evict them, but to remind them that my grandfather's legacy wasn't something to sell off cheaply, to waste on meaningless excess. That night, I drove back to my apartment, opened the window, and looked at the night sky. The stars twinkled just as they had when I sat with my grandmother on the Stamford rooftop. I held her letter, reading it once more. Let this money grow through your wisdom and principles. I had done it not just with the money in my account, but by living true to what she and my grandfather taught me. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need their apologies. I just needed to know that somewhere my grandfather and grandmother were watching me, and they were smiling. The days following Christmas, the atmosphere in Tribeca grew tense, at least for my family. I wasn't there, but Tom, the building manager, sent me brief matter-of-fact reports that painted a clear picture. My father, Uncle Harold, Mike, and Lily held meeting after meeting, scrambling to deal with the new rent prices. They called lawyers, threatened lawsuits, even tried contacting the owner, me, through intermediaries. But I had instructed Tom to keep my identity confidential. I didn't want a direct confrontation, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted them to face the consequences of the choices they'd made over the years. Lily was the first to leave. Tom told me she packed her things just a week after the notices, moving to a smaller apartment in Brooklyn where rent was far cheaper. She stopped posting glamorous photos on Instagram. Her account went quiet, with only a few vague posts about new beginnings and finding herself. I don't know if she truly changed, but I hoped even just a little that she'd learned something from this. Mike left soon after, moving to a condo in Jersey City. He sold his last Porsche to pay off debts, and I heard he was working for a small real estate firm trying to get back in the game. I didn't believe he'd succeed, not because I looked down on him, but because I knew he still hadn't grasped the true value of hard work and discipline. My father and Uncle Harold tried to hold out longer, but by February they couldn't stay either. Dad moved to a rented house in suburban Connecticut near Greenwich, the place he once proudly called the Whitaker Kingdom. Uncle Harold relocated to Florida, living in a budget retirement community, chasing new investment schemes I was certain would fail. They stopped calling me, stopped texting, stopped pleading. Maybe they were too proud, or maybe they realized I was no longer the poor soldier they used to mock. Whatever the reason, I didn't care. I had done what needed to be done, not to punish them, but to remind them that my grandfather's legacy wasn't something to squander. I didn't stop at the Tribeca complex. After that deal, I set my sights higher. Whitaker Holdings, the conglomerate my grandfather built, had nearly collapsed after years of my father and Uncle Harold selling off shares. But I didn't want it to vanish. I started reaching out to former shareholders, people who had worked with my grandfather, and offered to buy back their stakes. It wasn't an easy journey. There were nights I sat in my makeshift office, papers piled high on the desk, my phone burning up with negotiation calls. There were moments I wondered if I was attempting the impossible. But then I'd think of my grandfather, how he rose from nothing, and I pressed on. By the end of that year, I had reclaimed over 50% of Whitaker Holdings shares. I didn't run it like my father or uncle had. I hired a professional team, people who shared my vision. To build, not destroy. To invest, not spend. Alongside reviving Whitaker Holdings, I established a charitable foundation in my grandmother's name, the Evelyn Whitaker Foundation. It focused on education and support for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, like my grandfather, once a poor boy in Boston. I didn't want the foundation to be just a name. I got personally involved, selecting projects, meeting beneficiaries. Once I visited a vocational training center in Harlem where students were learning to code. A girl no older than 15 looked at me and asked, "Do you think I can do something big even though I have nothing?" I smiled, thinking of my grandfather, and said, "You can do anything if you don't give up." Her eyes lit up, and I knew that was why I was doing this. I didn't change my lifestyle, despite my wealth surpassing anything I'd imagined. I still lived in my small rented apartment in Virginia, drove my old pickup truck, wore simple clothes. Some days I'd return from the base exhausted after a long training session and sit down with a cup of tea gazing at the night sky. I didn't need a Manhattan penthouse or loud parties. I found joy in simple things, a good book, a quiet evening, and the knowledge that I was living true to what my grandparents taught me. But not every day was easy. Some nights, sitting alone, I wondered if I'd been too harsh on my family. I didn't want them to suffer, didn't want them to lose everything. But I knew if I hadn't acted, they'd have continued living in delusion, destroying my grandfather's legacy. I remembered when I was 10 and my grandfather took me to a vacant lot in Stamford where he planned to build. He pointed at the empty land and said, "Nathan, one day you'll build something of your own. But remember, building is 100 times harder than destroying." I had done it, not just with money, but with my heart and principles. One late year evening, I drove to my grandmother's old house in Stamford. It was still there, small and simple, a far cry from the mansions my father and uncle once owned. I walked to the rooftop where she and I used to watch the stars when I was a boy. The night sky was unchanged, filled with twinkling stars, as if they were retelling my story, my grandfather's, my grandmother's. I opened her letter, now worn from countless readings. "Let this money grow through your wisdom and principles." I whispered to myself, "Grandma, I haven't let you down. I don't know what will become of my family. Maybe Lily will find a new path, though I doubt she'll stray far from her old ways. Maybe Mike will learn to stand on his own, or maybe he'll keep chasing illusions. My father and Uncle Harold, I hope they'll reflect and see their mistakes, but I don't hold much hope. I did what I could. I can't change them, but I can change how my grandfather's legacy lives on." The Whitaker story doesn't end here. Whitaker Holdings is reviving step by step under my leadership. The Evelyn Whitaker Foundation is making a difference, even if in small ways. And I, Nathan Whitaker, remain a soldier, a man living by discipline and gratitude. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing. I'll keep building, not to boast, but to keep my promise to those who believed in me. I stood on the rooftop, breathing in the cold winter air, gazing at the stars. They were still there, silent and eternal, like the lessons my grandparents left behind. I sipped my tea, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you, Grandma." I didn't need the world to recognize me. I just needed to know I'd lived right, and that, somewhere among the stars, my grandparents were smiling.